Good morning, everybody, and thanks for watching. So, today I'm going to go over one of the most important concepts in all of Scripture in Paul's letter to the Romans, one that is really completely missed in Christianity. And I'm going to go through in detail how it's missed, why it's missed, and kind of set the record straight here. This is going to be a deep dive into Romans. So I'm going to try to finish this in one video, but it might take me two, so we'll see here. But what I'm going to go over is how the Apostle Paul sets up the law of sin and death. Explains what it is. He explains that people are pursuing it for glory, honor, incorruption, peace by good acts. They are pursuing righteousness. Paul says that. But then he says that no one can achieve this righteousness, that everyone falls short. And then he comes up with the way that we actually do attain God's righteousness, which is something different from the law of sin and death. So, in this letter, Paul sets up the law of sin and death in order to show people, in order to show the Romans, that no one can get to God by the law of sin and death, by law, by doing works or good acts in the flesh. He is not explaining it as if people can achieve it. He's explaining it to show people that they cannot achieve it, to represent the only way that we get God's righteousness, which is through Jesus Christ's faith, his death for sin, his entombment, and his resurrection. But what Christianity continues to do is they continue to try to achieve their salvation through this law of sin and death that Paul says is the very way that we don't get God's righteousness. And I'm going to show you how they do that. So whenever someone says you must not sin to gain or maintain your salvation in any way, they are quoting the law of sin and death and what Paul said no longer gets you justified, no longer gets you saved, no longer gets you God's righteousness. It's like a 50-foot hurdle that no one can jump. Jesus jumps us, and we are planted with Jesus, and we jump it with him. But what Christianity continues to try to do is say that Jesus Christ jumped it, now he gives us the Spirit, or now he makes it possible for us to jump the 50-foot hurdle. And in essence, what they're doing and what they're saying is that Jesus Christ freed us from the law of sin and death just in order for us to achieve the law of sin and death. So Christianity always in their arguments brings us back to the law of sin and death, which was abolished and explained by Paul, abolished by the work of Jesus Christ. So any mention of Jesus died for us, and now because we have the Spirit, or we have now we have the power to stop sinning, or now we have the power to do this or do that. So if you do this, then yes, you're saved. But if you don't do this, you're not. That's just bringing you right back to the law of sin and death, in which Jesus abolished and freed us from, and what Paul explains here in Romans. And I'm going to go through it verse by verse because it's so very important, because every Christian argument tries to bring you back to the law of sin and death. And if you understand the law of sin and death is done, and it's in no way by what we get justification, then you can eliminate all those arguments, every single one of them. So what is, first of all, the law of sin and death? Well, the law of sin and death is that sin must be punished. It results in death. Maybe not punished is the right word. It's just death is the result of sin. As far as Adam goes, Adam sinned, he began to die. We inherit this death from Adam. So sin and death, and on this death we sin. So sin and death go hand in hand. And we have this law that was given to Moses and was given to Israel in order to keep this. This is a standard of God's righteousness that no one can achieve, right? And the law of sin and death is, in essence, you do good, you follow the law, you do what God says, God does good things for you. If you don't follow the law, or you fail at the law, or you don't listen to what God says, then you get bad things. Reward, punishment. That's the way things worked in the Old Testament. That's the law of sin and death. We have to do this in order to get this reward. If we don't get it. And it's all based on the flesh, and it's all related to sin and death. The law of sin and death. So this is what Paul sets up in his first 3 chapters of the book of Romans. He sets it up and explains what the law of sin and death is in order to say that that's not the way that we're saved. He sets it up to show that nobody can achieve justification through this law of sin and death. But yet, religion continues to quote these verses and use these verses all over in order to prove you have to do it in order to be saved or justified, which is a horrendous error. So first, in Romans chapter 1, 14 and 17, who is Paul speaking to here? He says, to both Greek, and this shuts up the argument of who this message is for. Is it just for Jews? Is it just for Greeks? Is it just for, then it shuts it up. Because it explains directly who this is for, and there's no argument about it. This message is for all who believe. Plain and simple. You believe, it's for you. Doesn't matter what your nationality is. Doesn't matter if you're a Jew. Doesn't matter if you're a Greek. Doesn't even matter if you're a barbarian. It's to all those who believe, and Paul explains this, to both Greeks and barbarians, to both wise and foolish, a debtor am I. Thus this eagerness of mine to bring the evangel to you also who are in Rome, for not ashamed am I of the evangel, for it is God's power for salvation to everyone who is believing, to the Jew first and to the Greek as well. So this is to everyone. Everyone has this message. And it's on those that believe. So it's through belief that you get these promises. So Romans 1:18, Paul is explaining the law of sin and death. As I went through before, Paul talks about those who are seeking glory, honor, incorruption, peace by their good acts. And those who are not seeking this, these people are stubborn, and they're not seeking this glory through their works. But that's the law of sin and death. Paul is explaining this. Romans 1:18 says that indignation is on the irreverence and injustice of men. So Paul is explaining this in Romans chapter 1. But I'm going to allude here to Romans chapter 4 and Romans chapter 5. Just really quick, I'm going to come back to it. But I want to show you how Paul is setting up the law of sin and death here, only in order to explain the way in which we do get God's justification. He's not saying that this is the method we need to follow. He's explaining it in order to show us that it's not the method by which we get saved. So Romans 1:18, based on the law of sin and death, indignation is on the irreverent. God's indignation is on the irreverent and the injustice of men. But yet, we go to Romans 4, verse 5, it says God who is justifying the irreverent. So in the law of sin and death, indignation is on the irreverent and the injustice. However, Paul later explains in the true gospel that God is justifying the irreverent. So how can indignation be on the irreverent in Romans 1:18 and yet God be justifying the irreverent in Romans 4:5? Romans 5:7. For starting in verse 6, for Christ, while we are still infirm, still in accord with the era, for the sake of the irreverent died. Again, Paul is saying in Romans 1:18 that God's indignation is on the irreverent. And yet, he goes on to say later in the very same letter that God is justifying the irreverent and that Christ died for the irreverent while they're irreverent. So in one instance, his indignation is on the irreverent in the law of sin and death, but in Paul's true message, God is justifying the irreverent while they're irreverent. So that's just a preliminary snapshot on how Paul sets up the law of sin and death. That's what it is. Discards it, and then shows you the true method by which we're saved. And I'm going to go into more detail on that here. So Romans 1:28-32, God again, Paul in Romans 1, 2, and most of chapter 3 is setting up the law of sin and death. So God gives them over to a disqualified mind. He lists all their sins and that they are deserving of death. So he's talking about the law of sin and death. These people have done bad. They're doing poor acts. They're sinning. They don't care about God. So they're deserving of death. Sets all that up. Romans chapter 1, 28-32. Romans 2:3. God will judge. God will judge these people. Christians love these verses. Romans 2:5. Hoarding indignation in the day of indignation. That's what these people are doing. That's Romans 2:5. Romans 2:7. God will be paying each one in accord with his acts. Doers of the law shall be justified. And the flip side of that, if you don't do the law, you won't be justified. That's Romans 2:13. So that's all the law of sin and death. Doers of the law shall be justified, Paul says. But later, very soon here, he says that no one is justified by the law. And in fact, apart from the law, we get God's righteousness. So Paul is just explaining how you get righteousness through the law of sin and death. Is going to tell us that no one can get righteousness through the law of sin and death in order to discard it and show us the real way that we get righteousness. So Paul is not teaching us here, even though he says doers of the law shall be justified, he's not teaching that doers of the law shall be justified. He's just saying this to show you what we cannot do, what we have failed at, the law of sin and death, and what is no longer in operation, so that we truly understand what is in operation. But Christians still believe that this is in operation, the law of sin and death, and they always try to bring their arguments back to you completing the law of sin and death in some form in order for you to get Christ's justification, God's justification, that can only be achieved apart from this. So Paul sets up the law of sin and death, explains it, goes over what it is, how you get righteousness through it. And then he says in Romans 3:10-11 that all fall short, all fail of achieving God's righteousness through the law of sin and death. All are under sin. Not one is just. Not one. So no one has achieved God's righteousness through this process that Paul has explained in the first 3 chapters of Romans. In Romans 3:19 to 20, Paul says the entire world may become subject to the just verdict of God, because by works of law no flesh at all shall be justified. Do you see that? In verse 13 of chapter 2, Paul says, doers of the law shall be justified. God will be paying each one accord with his acts, Romans 2:7. This is all the law of sin and death. So Paul is saying doers of the law will be justified, but here he says, just a few verses later, by works of law, no flesh shall be justified. So he presents the law of sin and death and what you have to do in order to get God's justification. Then he says that no one can do it. Christians ignore this. They think they can do it. These verses don't apply to them. The verses in chapter 1 through 3, Christians think that does apply to them. They think they can do this law of sin and death. Yeah, Christ may have done something for them to give them a boost, give them the Spirit, do something in them so that now they can achieve the law of sin and death. Paul is not saying that. Paul is setting up the law of sin and death just to show that no one can do it, and now we're getting God's righteousness completely apart from that law of sin and death. And any mention of going back to that law of sin and death is wrong. And it denies the true way that we get God's righteousness. And Paul explains that, the way we get God's righteousness, in Romans 3:21 to 23. Paul now talks about how we get that righteousness. Yet now, apart from law, a righteousness of God is manifest, being attested by the law and the prophets, yet a righteousness of God, here it is, through Jesus Christ's faith, for all and on all who are believing. And he says it again, for there is no distinction, for all sinned, all fall short of the glory of God. All have failed at this law of sin and death that he has presented in the first 3 chapters of Romans. And now the only way we get God's righteousness is apart from that, apart from us, and according to Christ's faith, his death for sin, his entombment, and his resurrection alone. It's not Christ's death for sin and then Christ gives us the Spirit, so now we can go back to the law and death, sin of law and death, and achieve it. God doesn't give us the power to achieve the law of sin and death that was already abolished here by the Apostle Paul. And I'm going to go into that and explain how that's proven in these verses. So Romans 3:28, man is justified by faith apart from works of law. And remember, faith is a gift of God. Romans 12:3, in this very letter, God gives to each a measure of faith. Those who are destined for aeonian life are given faith. So God chooses who knows Christ and gives them faith in their lifetime. So there's no works of the flesh here at all. So going back to Romans 4:5 and Romans 5:6-7. Remember, in Romans 1:18, according to the law of sin and death, God's indignation is on the irreverent, because that law of sin and death is based on human acts. How people act, how they follow or don't follow the law, the good things they do, the bad things they do, the good things they do or the bad things they do. The law applies to that, and they get good things based on their behavior. That's the law of sin and death. So God's indignation is on the irreverent. But in Romans 4:5, as I said before, God is justifying the irreverent. And in Romans 5:6-7, Jesus Christ died for the irreverent while they're irreverent. It doesn't say that they turned from being irreverent to be saved. No, they are saved in their irreverence. They are justified while they're irreverent, and that proves that it is not done by their acts. If it was done by any act of their own, by a faith choice or by not committing certain sins, then they would stop being irreverent in order to earn this in some way. But they don't stop being irreverent. Paul says this in order to prove that it's not based on their acts. The only thing that's changed here is not whether they're reverent or not. They're still irreverent. It's that God has changed based on what Christ Jesus has done. God doesn't change, of course, but his operation with humanity does. He's not operating with them anymore through the law of sin and death, so that in the law of sin and death, God's indignation was on the irreverent. Now God is dealing differently based on Jesus Christ's faith, his death for sin, his entombment, and his resurrection. So now the irreverent, not because they changed in any way, they're still irreverent, but God justifies the irreverent because Christ died for them while they're irreverent. So in the law of sin and death, God's indignation was on the irreverent. But in what Paul's explaining, in God's grace, God's justification, mercy, is on those very same irreverent people. So it's God's operation towards humanity that has changed. It's not humanity's action or acts that have earned them this righteousness. It's completely from Christ's faith, his death for sin, his entombment, and his resurrection. So all of this is explaining justification by faith, not works. Christians keep trying to insert the law of sin and death into all these verses. If you look at Romans chapter 5, I've been over this many times, 18 to 21. Consequently then, as it was through one offense for all mankind for condemnation, thus also it is through one just award for all mankind for life's justifying. Right? That verse is clear. By Adam's one act, we get condemnation, and it's for all mankind. Thus also, that means in the exact same way we get death from Adam, get condemnation from Adam, by Christ's one act, we are justified for all mankind. So if it's in the exact same way, then that means we did nothing to get this death and condemnation from Adam. So in the exact same way, just like explaining here that in the law of sin and death, the irreverent got indignation, and then later Paul says that very same irreverent are justified, and Christ died for them while they're irreverent. Well, same thing here, based on no act of our own, but solely based on Jesus' act, the very same all that got death from Adam get justification from Christ in the exact same way by no choice of their own. It's not based on their acts, not based on their faith decision, not based on anything they do. It's based on what Christ has done. Just like we got death from Adam by his one act, we get life from Christ by his one act. And this is completely consistent with Paul setting up the law of sin and death and then explaining how all have failed at that, and now it's all based on Jesus Christ. Going on, for even as through the disobedience of the one, the many, this here is clearly referring to the all mankind, constituted sinners, thus also through the obedience of the one, the many shall be constituted just. Yet the law came in, this is verse 20, yet law came in by the way that the offense should be increasing. Yet where sin increases, grace superexceeds that. Even as in sin reigns in death, thus grace also should be reigning through righteousness for life aeonian through Jesus Christ our Lord. So that verse there, Romans 5:20, blows up every argument that a Christian has that we ever go back to the law of sin and death. I just had a guy respond to one of my videos with this sanctification crap where, yeah, Jesus died for our past sins, but once we come to faith, Jesus gives us the power to stop sinning, and we need to live a better life and not commit certain sins, or even not sin at all, because Jesus gives us the power. Well, that verse, Romans 5:20, completely blows up any notion of even having the Spirit and not sinning, because it says where sin increases, grace super exceeds. So the more you sin, the more the grace rises above it to overcome that sin. So in any area, in any weird argument that Christians want to use to get back to the law of sin and death, this verse completely eliminates any possibility of that, because the more you sin, the more grace overcomes that sin. And then what's the natural response from a religious person? Oh, you're saying you just can go out and sin and do whatever you want and you're still going to be saved? That's exactly what Paul's saying here. What else do you think? If you increase your sin, that grace super exceeds it. What else do you think that means? And Paul anticipates that argument. He knows Christians in the 21st century, just like they did back here in his day. He knows they're going to say that. He knows they're going to come to this immature conclusion. And it's an immature conclusion because they don't understand that grace leads you to sin less. See, no one, once we truly understand grace, is going to go out and sin more. Grace is the driving force behind us not sinning. So anyone that says, oh, I'm free to sin, now I'm going to sin more, doesn't get grace. So Christians don't get grace because they still inject, they say they do, but they still inject the law of sin and death into this grace message. Because they say, oh, if you sin, you still get this. If you don't sin, then, it shows that you're saved. So it's all based on sin and death. They'll admit that there's grace, but then they take Paul's first 3 chapters and they bring it back to this grace message and they mix the two. So now they go back to the law of sin and death that has been abolished, that we are freed from, that we're going to find out in these later verses here. So where sin increases, grace super exceeds. Paul anticipates people saying, oh, that means you can sin all you want, because in the very next verse, Romans 6:1, Paul says, what then? Shall we declare that we may be persisting in sin, that grace should be increasing? May it not be coming to that, Paul says. Paul says, of course you shouldn't be doing that, but he would only say this if his message was saying exactly that sin doesn't matter anymore. The more you sin, grace super exceeds it, because even going back to, oh, are you committing this sin? Are you committing this sin? Did you not commit this sin? Is going back to the law of sin and death. So Paul is explaining that these sins cannot in any way keep you from God through Christ ever again. And again, he anticipates, it's only by saying that he would have to anticipate that people would say, oh, should we sin so that grace should be abounding? He says, no, of course not, you numbskulls. You're dead to sin. So you should be living a life to Christ. But if you're not living a life to Christ, that is not what gets you your righteousness. Your righteousness is achieved by Christ, not by you living for Christ, because that would be going back to the law of sin and death. We live for Christ because of what Christ has done for us, not in order to earn or maintain what he has done for us. And then Paul says this very same thing 15 verses later in Romans 6:15, which proves again that he is talking about how sin cannot hold anybody away from God ever again because of Christ's work. All will eventually be saved. Yes, people are giving faith now to believe what Christ has done, and they get in early. But they get in early in order to work with Christ, be his complement, in order to bring the rest in. So all of creation will be in. Those that don't believe will come in through judgment, but all are saved based on Jesus Christ's faith, his death for sin, his entombment, and his resurrection. So Romans 6:12 through 14 here. I'm going to call this video, I'm going to finish it up in my next video. I'm going to go into more detail proving this. But I'm going to end it here, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.